They came with the smell of sap and cold iron. The small ones with eyes like damp moss and skin the color of old bark. And they did not come in dreams. They threaded through the black pines of the wolf's wood at a pace between a deer's care and a brook's certainty, stepping where needles lay thick and soundless, keeping to paths that had not been traveled by men in living memory, but remembered them anyway. The air was taut with the kind of cold that makes breath thin and bright. It felt like the land itself had drawn in and held. Crows slept with their heads tucked beneath their wings. A wolf's howl rose once, far off, as if to mark the hour when things that survive by dark custom stir and regard one another. The one who led them wore a circlet of bone slivers and red-tinged leaves, a token not of rank, but of vow. She was not old in the way men reckon years, though her people took years as they took water, when there was water, drinking and forgetting the counting. To men she would have been called Leaf because that was a sound their tongues could hold. Among her own she had another name, which was a song shaped around 3 notes that meant sap rising, and the ache of thaw, and the hair-thin crack in ice that makes the whole lake shiver, though nothing breaks. She carried no spear. At her waist, a sheaf of black glass arrowheads hung from plated sinew. The obsidian drank the faint light. Each shard was keen enough to nick the air as she moved. They reached the edge of a stream that kept open by muttering to itself under a hood of rime. The stars were so clear that the sky appeared to be a wind-polished bowl. A white owl blinked once and let them pass like a thought. On the far bank, the old trees thinned and surrendered to the long drift of snowfields rolling toward Winterfell. Leaf knelt and touched 2 fingers to the water. The cold climbed into her hand and lived there a moment. She did not flinch. She lifted her hand to her brow as if anointing herself, then straightened. "It listens," said the one behind her softly in the first tongue, and the words made ghosts of themselves in the air. "It always listened," Leaf answered. "Now it will answer, and men will wish it did not." Endamnal. They crossed where the water lisped around stones, leaping to keep their feet dry. They were not made for deep snow, but for the green murk of old summer. Yet they did not balk. When they reached the bare country, they spread out, a drift of small figures that disappeared when it suited them. The way mist abandons a field and then, without weight or sound, returns to it. Leaf did not vanish. She went on openly, making for the strange castle that smoked from its own heart and wore the smell of hot stone and wolves. Winterfell rose from the white, like the knuckles of some buried thing. She felt the murmuring under her soles grow louder, not the stream's tongue now, but another voice, the one that had gone into the earth when the earth was young, and which men called gods because they had no other word. That voice did not belong to her people alone. It had never belonged to anything that could be counted or named once and for all. She listened, because that was the only thing that had ever preserved any of them. By the time she reached the outer wall, dawn was beginning to think of itself. It had not chosen to be made yet. The watchman on the rampart leaned forward and almost shouted, then did not shout. She heard him turn to another man and speak in the thick syrup of a northern voice. She stood, unarmed, her hands empty. The gate opened with the slow unwillingness of a jaw that has clenched all night. Men came with spears and looks like the tops of pines in wind. They were not cruel. They were the kind of men who fed dogs with one hand while the other kept hold of a knife. They stared at her with childhood and caution both, because their mothers' had told them this shape and skin and its deed names long ago, and because there had not been a reason to think of such stories, except long winter evenings when truth and shadow share a chair by the same fire. "Tell your lord," Leaf said in a voice that felt like the place where smoke meets breath. "Tell him a singer has come who remembers, and that what is remembered is waking." "Which lord?" asked the nearest guardsman. "There are lordlings aplenty." He said it gruffly, but gruffness is often a coat put on over something thinner. "Tell the Lord of Winterfell," she answered. "Tell Rickard Stark." They took her in. They did not bind her hands, which she noted and made note of without writing. She was shown through a draft-smelling corridor of stone that had sweat in it despite the cold. She glimpsed a courtyard where a boy with dark hair and a coal-smudged face was taking a hammer to a strip of glowing iron, his mouth pressed into an earnest line. Another boy watched from a little distance. Leaner, quieter, already measuring the world for its straight places. The second one's eyes found her, and in them she saw the work of a winter sky done on a spring face. He blinked. She did not smile at him. Smiles were for the end of things, or for the moments when the end was not in sight. It was too soon for either. In the great hall, under the black beam ribs and the banners with their gray direwolves, Rickard Stark listened as he ate. His knife and his judgment were both clean. The meat on his trencher steamed. His beard was salted black and white, his hair the color of distant trees. He did not reach for the wine. His eyes went from Leif's face to the arrowheads on her belt to her bare hands and back. "Song?" he said, tasting the sound she had given as her name in the corridor. "They told me a singer had come. It is not my habit to say prayers into the face of my meat, and I will not begin now, but for courtesy I say this. You are a guest. Speak." She stood at the edge of the light, as if she could borrow more easily from the shadows there. The hall's heat did not soften the bite of the air. She looked past the Lord for a moment to the carved face beyond him, the one growing from the weirwood trunk that fed itself up through stone and wood from the god's wood below. Its red eyes both paint and not paint, both sap and something else. The face did not move. It took her looking as it took snow and wind and oaths. Winter has always been a road. She said, "Men think it is an enemy. Sometimes it is. More often, it is a road. There are things that travel on roads. You call them others because there was a time when you did not wish to share a name with what moves in the dark and makes music with your bones. They are awake. We have sung to the deep places that lie under the snow and asked whether this was a dream, a story told to frighten children back to their pallets when they creep too close to the door. And the deep places have answered. They are awake. They are coming with the patience that belongs to coal. They. Silence is not the absence of noise. It is a beast that climbs into a room and crouches among men and makes them wait. It did that in the hall. Somewhere a log collapsed in the fire and struck a hiss from its own sap. "How early do you mean?" Rickard Stark asked after a time. "And what do you mean by early? If a man is dying, his wife might say the fever took him early if it took him before his son was grown, or before he had finished his roof, or before he saw a summer worth rare as gold. Early is a matter of whose counting it is." "Though, before your children have gray in their hair," Leif said. "Before your beard goes white, Lord of Winterfell. Before songs written this spring have been forgotten. Early." "Now." The Lord's face did not move, but his knuckles whitened on the knife's hilt. "And you have come why? Because once we did not come. Once we hid and sang to stones and roots, and thought that would be enough because the world is old enough to carry itself without being told how. That was a foolish thought. Or if not foolish, tired. We are tired. We do not like what wakes to our fears and speaks with our dead when we have no words left. We came because men spend lives as if they were kindling, and because you have a castle that smokes in winter and remembers birdsong in summer, and because your blood has made oaths to trees we planted when the sky was closer. We came because you remember a little. That is more than most. Then, you want my banners to ride with your people." Rickard's voice did not know whether to make it a question or a ridicule, and left it somewhere between. "I want you to see without closing one eye," Leif said. "Then you will do what you do, because men always do what they do. But we will have told you. That is the work that remains to us. We have told you, and we will tell others, and perhaps one day the telling will be enough to make what comes smaller than it would have been." "Mando and Shao." Rickard Stark looked past her to where his two sons stood in the sideways light by the screens. The quiet one had come in from the yard and stood now with his hands clean of soot. The older, the tall one, had a careless grace to him, the kind that carries both swords and women like a thing that belongs in his hand. The Lord's wife had died some winters past, and the grief for that had turned to a polished stone he carried in his pocket, smooth with touching. He often took it out without knowing and turned it while he thought. He was turning it now. "You'll eat," he said at last. "You will bathe. You will be given furs and a pallet. Then you will come with me to the Godswood, and you will say what you have said here, and say it to my heart's tree. If it is a lie, perhaps it will not pass my ears when I stand beneath its leaves. If it is truth, we will speak again." "I have no lies to bring you," Leaf said. It was not pride. It was the tiredness again, worn longer than boots. "I have songs. They are not the same." He rose with the knife in his hand and put it down carefully on the table. He was a man who had learned that the way you lay down a thing owns what it had to say about you. "We will go now." Then, to his sons over his shoulder, "Brandon, stay. Ned, come." "Then I will." The quiet boy took a step forward before anyone saw him move. He had his mother's mouth. He had his father's carefulness, and something in him that listened before it spoke. He followed his father and the small singer out under the arch and through the corridor, down the curving steps where the stone had been worn by many boots that believed in the day's work, into the cold that pressed up from the inner yard. Steam from the hot pools lay like breath over the flagstones, and he smelled the iron in the water, the way it made the back of his throat taste like a coin. The Godswood was a hush of ancient. The air moved differently inside it. The leaves were not leaves, not this time of year. The heart tree's white bark lifted raw and smooth as skin over a scar. Its carved face was clean, but the red in its mouth had dried dark. The eyes were not eyes, not only. Ned stood a pace behind his father, waiting to be told where to stand. He saw the small woman, girl. No, not a girl, not ever a girl. Step toward the tree and lay her palm against its trunk. The snow underfoot had been touched by old feet. There were prints layered upon prints. Leaf, dentaramal. The sound she made did not unmake the world or bend branches to touching. That belonged to stories, and to the way men told what they had been given, so that they might be asked to give something in return. The song was thinner and more dangerous than that. It was the kind of music you hear when a knife leaves its sheath. The kind that is not loud until you realize it has been going on for a long time, and you had not noticed because you were busy, because your child was crying, because a pot needed taking off the fire. It went into the tree and into the stone under the tree, into the water under the stone, into the old bright things that lay where men do not go to count. Ned did not understand the words, not with his learning, but his blood understood that something had entered that did not belong to it, yet had a right to be there. His father's face was turned up as if listening for a sound that came from behind him. His breath smoked evenly. Snow slid off a branch and struck softly. At the song's end, Leaf bowed her head and did not speak until the silence had filled its own hands. "You heard," she said simply. "I heard," Rickard Stark answered, and Ned could not tell whether fear lived in the word or faith, or both. "I heard, and I remembered something I had not known, I had ever known." He turned to his son then. "Send Benjen for Sir Roderick. Tell him to ready riders for the King's Road. Send ravens to Last Hearth, to Carhold, to White Harbor, to the Dreadfort. Tell them I call a hosting at Winterfell in 10 days. Then go to the Rookery and have Maester Lewin write me a letter to Castle Black. We will go together and take the letters with us. If there is any truth in this, and I have heard truth, I will look upon the wall while there is still time to do more than carve names into its stone." "Maester Pearl." Ned bowed his head. He did not say that he had already thought to do the same. He did not say anything. He ran light-footed through the yard, the steam curling up around his calves, and through the arch to the maester's turret, where the ravens looked like Winter's own thoughts. The word went out from Winterfell on black wings and on iron-shod hooves. It went south and east and over the white fields where hares had burrowed. It went to halls where wolves' heads were nailed over doors, and to those where they were carved in stone. Men held the small roll of bark in their mittened hands and felt the weirwood's particular smoothness under the scraped skin. And they warmed the seal with breath and broke it, and they told their wives to mend their collars and pack oats, and they called boys who were not boys anymore, and they counted arrows they had been counting for years without thinking why. In the Rookery at Winterfell, Lewin tied 7 messages and then untied one of them to add a final line, because Lord Rickard had changed his mind as men do when they are lifted into thinking by the height of their own blood. The maester had a chain that was not glittering. It was made of humble metals and of rarer ones, and he had earned each link by making his head go where it did not wish to go. He believed in things that could be weighed. He believed in words that had book leaves pinned to them. He took the singer's presence into his belief the way a man takes a stone from his boot and does not pretend it is a pearl. It had hurt him, and he could not ignore the hurt. The ravens went from Winterfell with their own small grudge against the heir. One of them went farther than the rest. It went to King's Landing. There, the small council chamber was a warmth that had pomegranates in it, and the king's mood lay across the day like a sour fog. Tywin Lannister was not yet hand. He had been hand and had been stripped of it for a pride that never called itself anything but duty. And Pycelle was smoothing his beard as if the smoothing could smooth what he heard. Varys had come to the city on quiet feet and lived in it the way a man lives in a costume he has made for himself with needles and patience. He had said almost nothing for 3 meetings. He said almost nothing now as the king's chief pyromancer whispered something about green dreams and the jars that sweated on their shelves. When the raven's letter was read, a plain thing unadorned by flourished hand, with words that called upon oaths older than the Iron Throne, a laughter went around the table like a friend you want to like but do not. Ariston did not laugh. His hands were long-fingered and restless. His nails were clean. The hair that would one day be ash was then only dull. He shut his eyes and his lips moved, and he was counting something no one else could hear. "Children," he said at last, with that peculiar emphasis, as if the word itself had the temerity to be a word, and not a person to be burned. "Children and tales. Rickard Stark weeps for a winter that hasn't even sent its first letter." He put a hand to his chest, to the cage he lived in alone. "I have dreams. They smell like smoke. Bring me the Master of Whisperers. Bring me Rhaegar." The prince was not in the Red Keep. He was in the room at the top of those steps that Summerhall had not finished burning, the room that remembered light with a hunger that woke with any flame. He sat on a stool with his silver harp on his knees, and he had been plucking at a phrase for hours. A phrase that was not music yet, but the promise in a kiss, or the taste of metal at the root of a tooth, when you are about to bite into a cold apple. Scrolls lay around him, old and smelled of damp bark and dust, and a little of mice. They were not all in Valyrian. They were not all about swords and fires. One of them had a line he had read too often now to misremember. "In the cold of the year when a king's line is ash, a song will be born under a bleeding star, and the song will be the sword." He read the words again, then looked up because sound had come across the ruin like a footstep that belonged to a woman he had loved once in a dream. There had been no woman. There had been a harp and a castle that had fallen trying to become a star, and a prince who had stood in its bones and wondered whether men are ever punished for wanting more than they are able to be given. The messenger who found him took a breath at the sight of him, and then remembered he was a prince, and exhaled it as a bow. Rhaegar took Rickard Stark's letter gently. He did not smile at the conceit of weirwood bark used for a seal. He read the words one by one, as if those words were stones he placed across a black stream. When he was done, he set the letter down on the sill, and went to the door, and looked back once, and the harp answered him with a small sound, as if the horse in the stable had lifted its head to see if that step would take the man away from it. He did not go to his father. He went to a window that had no glass left, and looked north until north stopped being a direction, and became a mountain in his mind. He saw close upon it the wall, which he had never touched with his own 2 hands, and he felt, not the cold people spoke of as if it were a knife, but something more patient. The cold of a bell that makes sound, because it is touched, and also because it is itself. In Winterfell, the snow chose to become snow again. The men came in by 1s and 2s, and then by files. They left the smell of horses in the lower yard, and drank smoke, and laughed in a way that needed no excuse. Brandon Stark laughed with them because laughter loved him, and would not be kept out. He drank toasts to his father's health, and to his sister's wildness, and to his own. Ned sat with Sir Roderick and rolled maps with his thumbs, and stared at lines he had seen in books, and on his father's knee, and now understood meant something else entirely when you measured them with hooves. Lyanna was a wind through the corridors, a quickness people moved out of without thinking. She had a way of vanishing at the edges of eyes. She came to the Godswood in the hour between kitchen noise and hall noise, and put her hand on the heart tree, where no one could see. She did not know why she did this except that she was a Stark, and the blood you pretend not to be listening to never stop speaking just because you teach your ears a trick. She stood there until the strange small woman appeared again with a look that was not a smile, but had mercy in it. "You ride like a note that will not be forgotten once played," Leaf said. Lyanna's mouth quirked. "Do you sing like a horse then?" Leaf inclined her head. "I sing like what makes the horse decide it is time to run." She lifted a hand and did not reach toward Lyanna's hair, though that had been her first thought. Men's children smelled so alive. "Your blood remembers. So everybody keeps saying." Lyanna scuffed at the snow with the toe of her boot. "Blood remembers. Blood remembers. Does it remember to be quiet when a man is talking? Does it remember how to make a wedding day not miserable? Does it remember a bit of kindness when a woman is being told where to put her feet for the rest of her life? If it does, I should like to know those songs." And now, Leaf had watched men learn their kindnesses as if they were tricks for dogs, for a very long time. What is coming does not ask what we thought we wanted. Let it be said you were already angry when it arrived. Anger is a coat. It is not armor. Sometimes it keeps you. Sometimes it keeps you from what will keep you. Now, Lyanna's eyes were the gray of melted snow. "They say you told my father something in the Godswood." "I did," Leaf said. "I told him the road is already under our feet, whether we pretend there is only a field or not. I told him that what walks on the road is older than crowns. The last time it came, it did not reach as far as it might have, because men and we and the other old things chose to remember. There are fewer old things now. Men have forgotten how to stand so near a tree they can hear what it refuses to say. We have forgotten so much, we cannot find our own remembering in time. And time has made mock of us because we taught it how to do that." "Done?" Lyanna laughed, quick and sudden. "My brother Brandon says time makes mock of everyone unless you fill it with drink and friends and a good horse." "Brandon is not wrong," Leaf said. "He is also not right. Two things can be cousins." "Men how so?" A horn sounded from the wall then, and Lyanna's head turned toward the cry of newly arrived riders, and the Godswood held them both for a heartbeat more and let them go. When Ned rode out with his father 2 mornings later, the sky was an iron with a light hammered thin behind it. They took a small company because snow eats many good intentions when too many hooves stir it into something that takes the next horse to its knees. Sir Roderick's beard bore a lace of frost that did not trouble him. The road north was the kind of road that knows only 2 songs. The one you sing when you go, and the one you sing when you come back. Leaf went with them a little while, unwilling to stay enclosed by stone when the air was full of speaking, then vanished when the trees thickened, and the world was what it had been before Winterfell was dreamed into being. It was not a trick with her kind. It was a way of belonging to more than one place, and choosing which room was needed. They reached the King's Road and followed it north, and by the 3rd day, men's talk had grown spare in the saddle. Not because there was nothing to say, but because the talk grew quiet when the cold laid its wide hand over them. The wall appeared not long after, as cliffs appear when you forget what horizon means. There it was, a face of blue and white made by men against what is not men. And Ned felt the ache of it in his teeth. Castle Black lay spread like a dropped handful of dark stones at its feet. Men moved there in black, and were small. When Lord Rickard's banner went up, the men came like crows. The way crows come, not because they are summoned, but because they know what gathering means. The Lord Commander then was Corgyle of Sandstone, whose eyes had never become used to pale weather, and who had made a hard marriage with it for decades. He greeted Rickard Stark with the weary courtesy of a man who has woken in the night more nights than he can name, and asked his bones to be kind, and they had declined. He heard the tale. He did not scoff. There was too much cold around him to scoff with his mouth. He led them to the foot of the wall where it met the woods eastward, and put his glove on the ice, and said, very softly, "Listen." They listened. The ice spoke in 1,000 slender voices. It spoke like a harp plucked in another room. It spoke like something settling into what it had been meant to be, but had not understood yet why it did not fit. It spoke like old bones dreaming of the deer that had moved them. Ned held his breath because he was afraid if he let it go, he would lose something the breath was trying to hold. "We have found dead things that did not wish to be dead when we lit them," Corjo said at last. "We have found men who were not men anymore, but the memory of what a man might be, if you kept only the parts you needed to climb and to bite. We have put black glass into the hands of boys with a year of oaths on them, and watched them live when they would have died otherwise. We have done this quietly because if we called the realm to our aid, the realm would send us sympathy and barrels of oats, and say that the cold makes cowards of men." Bento. He did not look at Rickard Stark when he said it. He looked at the wall as if it were a man who had told him once that they would die together, and he was not sure his friend remembered the promise. "I thought to send to you," he added, and the admission cost him a piece of himself he had not planned to give. "I did not wish to be a singer of nightmares at any lord's hearth. What came through your gate came where it was needed." Rickard said nothing for a time. When he did, it was in the voice Ned had always known meant his father had made a shape, and now would see if iron could be beaten to match it. "We will call a meeting," he said. "At Isle of Faces, if the green men will bear with men's company, or at Winterfell, if they will not. We will ask for lords and for maesters. We will ask for septons and for the men who carry iron, for men who speak fine words. We will show them what your black glass does when it is honest in a man's hand. We will put one of those dead things in chains of cold iron and have it behave for them. If they do not believe us then, they will never believe again." "Then answer." Ned turned his head sharply. His father's mouth had not trembled when he said it. He admired him for that, and was ashamed he admired him. Because to admire a man for not trembling, when he invited such a thing into his hall, was to admit to a kind of hunger for a tale that would not keep the people in it kind. "What you ask of me," Corgyle said very softly now, "is to give you horror to bring to a feast." "What I ask," Rickard said, "is that men use what they can be frightened by while they can still choose it. I do not love it. I did not love calling banners in a winter that has only put 2 fingers over the sun's mouth. But I will not be the man who tells my grandchildren a tale about why their bones are colder than mine." Corgyle looked at the boy next to Rickard Stark then, as if measuring how many winters that face would see, and nodded without liking it. "We will ride before dawn," he said. They rode. What they took back with them was not the worst the forest had to give, because the worst the forest had to give was not even awake enough yet to pretend it slept. They took a man who had been a man named Edirian Small, who had gone missing from a ranging 2 days past and then been found leaning quiet against a tree, as if he had stopped to think and then gone away where thinking did not matter. He wore chains because chains are a kind of spell that has nothing to do with words. His eyes were the color of bad milk. If you looked at him too long, you looked at yourself in a water bucket, where the water is not quite clean and not quite dirty, and your face does not belong to you. The ranger who had known him once cried without moving his mouth when they lashed him up in the hard sledge they'd built, because there is a way a hand hangs when its owner is not there that will go on troubling you after you think you have stopped remembering. They brought him to Winterfell under the shrouded faces of stars, and once in the night the sledge wood creaked and the chains sang, and Sir Roderick's sword came half free and did not finish the coming, because the thing that had been Edirian Small turned its head slowly, very slowly, and looked at a fire. The fire did not answer. It toiled in its fashion the way fires do, and denied that it owed explanations to anyone. In the yard Leaf stood and watched them come in. Her face did not change. She came forward and looked into the eyes that were a lake with scum on it and said in her small old voice, "This is not the worst. Be careful where you break." Nani. At the Isle of Faces, where green was old enough to be its own law, the green men discussed whether to open their groves to men with axes in their words. They were not men, not in the way of kings and banners, and when they made decisions, they made them with their hands on bark and with the fish moving in the water. Just so near their calves, that the moment when a thing touches you, and does not belong to your shape, tells you truths that arguments cannot. In Old Town the Archmaesters took off and put on the links of their chains, the way a man might adjust a belief before supper and after. And one of them, who had lost a brother beyond the snow gate long years ago, and did not discuss it, because grief belongs to the hearth, not the hall, pinched the skin between his eyes, and said that men have invented worse cures than the ones truth demands. Ravens talked to other ravens in the air and offered the sky black conversations that struck their wings and fell in flakes you could not see. At Harrenhal, where stone still remembered its own screaming, a prince played his harp, and decided that songs about fires burning are less useful than songs about hands touching. And he resolved to ride north under a false name, because nothing true he was did not owe something to the cold that calls men to be more than whatever room they have made for their courage. He thought of a lady with hair like a field of brown grass at dusk, who he had seen once and not forgotten, because forgetting is a trick he had not learned and did not wish to. He thought of his wife and his son, and the way the boy looked at him, as if he were not a prince, but a story that might grow kindly. He thought of the line in the old book again, and how it did not say whether the sword that becomes a song cuts one way only. In Winterfell, the day came when they were to show the realm the thing they had brought. Men gathered in the hall, thick with furs and opinions. The air smelled of iron and stew and fear. Lyanna stood on the screens, half hidden, and bit her lip until it should have bled. Except the blood did not come because fear takes blood away from the places where it can be seen. Brandon shoved his way through with a laugh that he did not feel all the way to his bones, and clapped Harden Umber on the back, until the great John-like laugh came from him in answer. And for a moment the hall remembered they were men and not ideas. Lord Rickard stood before the dais with Sir Roderick on one side, and Maester Luwin on the other, and Ned a pace behind, and to the left, where a shadow goes when it has learned to be useful. Leif stood near the heart tree's pillar where the weirwood's pale root showed through stone like a bone sliding under skin. The chains were drawn. The thing in them made no sound, and then made a sound that was not a sound but a shape, like frost racing across a window pane. It lifted its head. The room grew a little smaller. Someone swallowed and someone else spat, because men do both in the face of what they have made and what is making them at the same time. This was Adirian Small, Rickard said. He swore the oath of the Night's Watch 12 years ago. He laughed with his brothers. He slept in a bed that remembered the weight of him. He wrote to his sister and said that the wall was a friend that did not drink but spoke sense. He went out and did not come back, and when he came back he did not come back. Tricks, someone muttered too loudly. The old tricks. Wildling magics. Bogmen foolishness. Make the thing walk then. Make it sing your song. Manawa. Rickard looked at Leif, and did not look at anyone else. Leif did not move for a long heartbeat that taught Ned more about patience than any lesson had. Then she took the shard of black glass from her belt and handed it without looking to Ned Stark. He took it. Its edge drank light out of the hall, until the candle seemed suddenly to have grown mean. It weighed less than he expected, and more than he had hoped, because hope makes weights cruel. He stepped forward, and the air before him felt like a place where there had been a door, and now there was nothing. He put the point of the frozen fire against the thing's chest where a man's heart would be. His hand wanted to shake. He tightened his fingers, and that made the shaking smaller but not gone. He looked at his father, who looked at him and gave him a nod that meant, "You will be yourself in this, and I will be myself, and we will bear what that costs." Ned pressed. The sound that came then did not belong to the hall. It belonged to ice at dawn when thaw takes it in the teeth and says now. It belonged to a song Leif had not sung, and to a prince's harp. It belonged to the old stories that had not been written, but which the air had learned. The shard slid in. The thing that had been Adirian Small opened its mouth, and a breath came out that killed 3 candles and made the 4th burn blue. It went still. It did not fall as a man falls. It settled as a thought does when you have thought it already, and do not need to think it again. The sound of chains became the sound of chains and not of a winter river running through iron. There was no cheer. There was only the kind of exhalation men make when someone has finished a tune they had not chosen, and there is no more needing to be the person who listens. Black glass. Rickard Stark said into the silence, and he might as well have said swords or kings or oaths. The word had that weight. If you were planning a wedding, you will still be wed. If you were counting a store of barley, count it. If you were hoping for a mild season, hope. None of that has been stolen from you. But if you have a son who can hold a spear and a horse that can stand, bring them to Winterfell when I call. If you have a mind for words, bring it. If you have faith in the seven, bring your septon. If you kneel to the old, bring your silence. The world is very big. It cannot be lifted by one man. I think it can be lifted by a hall full of men and a grove full of trees and a wall full of oaths. I think it must be. Menetamda. There were murmurs, there were nods. There were looks men give each other when they have found a reason to like themselves better than they had a moment ago. Maester Luwin's quill scratched at nothing. He had brought no parchment. He was writing on the air because the air can hold a record longer than ink sometimes. After, when the hall had loosed its men into the yard, and into the winter evening, and the talk that follows fear, Ned stood in the entry and cooled his hand against the stone. Lyanna came up and touched his fingers and flinched. "You're cold as a weir," she said, and then laughed because to say it made the fear a smaller room. "You look like a statue, Ned. I don't think you blinked." "Dan?" "I did," he said, but he was not sure. "Did you hear the sound?" "I heard many sounds," Lyanna said. "I heard men deciding whether to have courage tomorrow or today. I heard Lord Glover's stomach. I heard an old song that I think I saw in a window once." "Leaf called it frozen fire," Ned said. He could still feel the black glass in his palm. Lyanna leaned and kissed his cheek quickly as if paying a debt she did not owe. "Don't be so solemn, you forget to live today," she said, and was gone with a whirl of a half-mended cloak. In the shadows by the pillar, Leaf watched him, and thought of the last time she had seen such a face. Years piled upon years ago, when a man with a crown he had not wanted had stood under a red sky and listened to a river change its name. Men do not believe in what the land believes in, she thought. They believe in what they can hold. She did not fault them. She had hands too. They were small, but they had never been empty. 2 weeks later, the gathering at the Isle of Faces was a thing that had to be coaxed out of its own reluctance. Boats came, their oars flashing like quick thoughts. Lords of the Riverlands and of the North and of the Vale came. A small man in sand-colored wool came from the west of the South, where courage learned to be thin and still count, and he stood very near a willow whose roots had drunk more kings' secrets than crowns have hair. A septon with eyes like warm milk came and laid his palm against a weirwood, and whispered a prayer to a god that wore 7 faces and face enough left over to be a tree. There had never been so many men there, not since a time when men had another word for time. The green men made their decision with dignity and a slowness that was not the slowness of age. They were courteous to fear, and to the need men have to talk, while they are still frightened enough to believe they are speaking to someone who can answer. Rickard Stark stood and spoke the plain words again, and the rangers who had brought the thing in chains stood at the edge of the clearing, and represented a hard kind of sorrow. They brought out the second of the dead that moved, because the first had been given back to the fire and to the long sleep, and this one had been a woman from the then valleys, whose brother had walked 100 miles with a wound in his foot, to tell men at the wall her name was not wife or sister, but Asha, and Rickard Stark had said her name aloud to the men gathered, and the name moved the air in a way the cold could not deed and complete. On the lakes, Skin the Sky stooped and looked, and then straightened. The wind came once and left. It was not all belief. Belief grows like frost on windows, not like fire. Some men went away carrying scoffs the way other men carry knives, tested from time to time with the thumb. Some men looked up into the canopy of leaf and bone-white limb, and saw the eyes carved there, and felt watched, and they did not like it. Some men wanted to know how much money it would cost, and whether the king would pay. A few wanted to know if the children might sing a song that would bring back a wife whose bones had ridden out to sea last spring beyond the arbor. No one asked whether there was time. Time was standing with them, and did not enjoy having itself spoken of in the third person. Prince Rhaegar came in a plain cloak and listened from the trees. He did not speak to anyone who would carry his words away with a bow. He spoke instead to a green-clad figure, whose antlered helm was not a helm, and to a small old singer, whose voice had found stones to rest in, for what remained of the long walk between forests. They spoke softly, And what they spoke of was not prophecies but maps, was not songs but roads, was not crowns, but the bone-deep question of how many men can stand in a line before the line breaks, and what you do with the ones who cannot stand. "Fire," said the green figure in a voice that was not leaves and could not be. "Fire wakes what it burns. Fire burns it too. The north has stone where the south has men. Stone remembers and cannot run. Men forget and run well. We will need both." "Mentor, Dragonfire," said Rhaegar without meaning to, and Leaf, the small one who remembered the ache of thaw, shook her head. "Not Dragonfire," she said. "Not only. It makes songs you do not wish to hear again when the song is over. There are old fires that burn under the mountains where obsidian is made. They do not sing like dragons. They sing like earth. We will need that. We will need iron that has forgotten greed. We will need faith that remembers kindness. We will need to teach men to hear trees again. We will need the South to think of the wall, not as a story of men in black, but as a door that belongs to them too." Rhaegar's mouth did something like a smile, and not like one. "We will need a king." Leaf looked at him as if he were not wrong, and as if being not wrong were not the same as being right. "You will need to be a man who knows his wife's hand by touch in the dark, and the shape of his son's laughing mouth, and the sound a harp string makes when it does not want to sing. The rest is songs men write to tell one another how to behave when their fear puts on silk." He did not bow to her. He considered it, and did not, because he did not wish to make of her a courtly thing when her court had no roof and never had. That night, when the moon made the lake a pale mouth, and the trees rustled secrets from leaf to leaf, the way a woman passes bread from hand to hand in a famine, a white thing stepped out of the water. There were men on the shore who later would have sworn that the water froze around its ankles as it came, and that the sound of the ice forming was thin and high and nearly merry. There were men who later would have sworn that there was no sound at all, and that their own blood had decided to thicken, so that the small hair on their arms stood, not from cold but from the desire to be elsewhere. What there was, undeniably, was a tall shape on two legs, whose armor was made of what should not have been armor, whose sword was thin as a breath caught in winter, and whose eyes were a color men think of as colorless until they see it where it does not belong, and then must find a name for. It did not run. It did not spread its arms and smile or hiss. It stood, and the standing was worse than any rushing could have been, because it is one thing to meet a wolf and another to meet a winter. On the far edge of the clearing, a wolf did howl then, as if to remind the gathered that these are not metaphors, but beasts with mouths. Rhaegar put his hand to his side and found he had brought no sword because he had not wished to be a prince that day. Rickard Stark took a breath and handed his black glass knife to Ned, and Ned took it again as if it had been waiting for his hand since before he had a hand to offer. The thing stood long enough for a man to learn a little about what patience means. Then the trees themselves moved with a wind that had no name, and Leaf stepped forward until she stood on the edge of the water and put her hand out as if to beg a horse's muzzle for gentleness. "We remember you," she said in a voice that grew a little wild on the last word, not for fear but because memory is a wild animal. "We remember what you were before you were what you are now. We remember the cold that did not bite but sang. We remember the bargains made when the sky was an unlaid egg. We remember we were fools. We remember we will be again." Nendan. The white shape did not look at her. It looked through her, or past her. Or it did not look at all because eyes are not always for looking. Then it raised its thin sword and pointed not at her, not at any man, but toward the north, as if it had been invited to a thing it did not need to be invited to, and wished to show the courtesy of acknowledgement without any of the courtesy of respect. Ned's breath sawed in his throat. He heard in his ear his sister's voice saying, "Do not be solemn," and he could not find where to put the advice. He held the frozen fire hard enough to feel its shape in the bone after. "Early," Leaf whispered, a word like a leaf crossing a stream. Not as early as it could have been, early enough. The thing walked backward into the water without turning. It sank without making ripples. The ice flowed over its head without cracking. It was gone and had never been. The men on the shore made all the sounds men make when a thing too big for them has passed, and left them unharmed and more hurt than if it had struck them. In the morning, there was frost on everything, though the day was not one that should have had frost. Rickard Stark rose stiff with the kind of stiffness that comes when a choice has been made inside a man. He looked at leafy crowns and at men's fur caps, and he said, in a voice that would be remembered by some who had never met him, "We go home. We call again. We build stores. We cut spears. We choose men. We teach boys quiet where quiet should live. We stop saying later. The road is under us. Men." Ned looked at him and saw the shape in him that had made Winterfell a place that did not only promise warmth, but kept men honest about the cost of it. He touched the black glass to his palm and felt it draw the heat and the heat return. A little. He thought of walls and oaths and of a girl who ran like something that had never been taught fences. He thought of Southron princes with songs, and of the way the world opens a little when a man decides to be bigger than the room he has been given. On the shore, Leaf knelt and pressed 2 fingers into the mud where the white thing had stood. She never believed that mud can be asked to remember anything. She had seen it do so. She looked up. The weirwoods rustled without wind. Somewhere, long miles away, a crow woke and laughed. The road underfoot did not ask them if they wished to walk it. It lay itself down, plain and frozen, from the Isle of Faces to Winterfell to the Wall, to the far and hungry north, and the steps men took upon it, then were quiet, careful, and, for the first time in a long while, in time, ka. The boats went with a calm that made sound seem like a trespass, oars dipping and rising, and Ned watched the Isle of Faces become a low, breathing shape behind them, green and bone-white and water dark all at once. The lake took their wake into itself and made no complaint. Leaf sat at the prow, as if water had been built to bear her shape since dawns were invented. Rickard Stark kept his cloak shut and looked not at the island or at the shore that waited, but into the middle of the gray, the way a man looks when the path inward is as long as any road. They reached the bank in a rasp of gravel and damp reeds. Men disembarked with the soft oaths of cold feet finding earth. The Stark riders had left a small fire cupped in a ring of stone, and it had not gone out. Ned felt its heat like a hand at his cheek, and did not lean in. He found he was listening for the sound the white thing's sword had made, thin and wrong as ice becoming itself, and he did not want the fire to steal whatever in him was still holding that note. Sir Rodrik checked girths, and the way the blankets sat under their horses' saddles. The men who had kept bows wrapped in oiled cloth now unwound them, and ran thoughtful fingers along the staves, not to test, but to be reassured. Rickard came to Ned and put his hand on his son's shoulder, as if to confirm that he was exactly the size a hand remembered. "You will write to the Vale when we are warm," he said without preamble. "Hoster Tully will have had news on the wind, but I will have him take our words too. And Jon Arryn? He teaches boys to stand like men without making them forget how to sit like boys. He will hear me. Tell him we will need quiet courage as much as noise." Ned nodded. The names made a map in him. The Eyrie rock and sky. River Run Sharp, where 2 rivers met like words in a mouth that can speak more than one language. He said, "And the Manderleys. White Harbor can be a mouth for ships. If Prince Rhaegar chooses to listen to old stones, Dragonstone is teeth for obsidian." Rickard's mouth made a shape that was not a smile and not a refusal to smile. "You think like a steward already," he said. "Good. Think like a wolf now. Have Sir Rodrik send to Bear Island. Jeor Mormont keeps a Valyrian sword that has not been taken to warmer places. The Wall will need that steel more than a hull. Ask him to lend it to his brothers in black. Use the word lend. There is a kind of pride that will climb into a boat when the word share will not. And They rowed, the sound of hooves a steady, patient hammering that never became a song, and the day pinned its gray to the world like a cloth held by careful fingers. When they made camp, Leaf stood at the edge of the trees and put her hand to bark the way a woman might lay a hand on a man's cheek, when words had earned themselves a rest. Ned watched her lips move and knew without understanding that the sound went underground and came up in other places. They reached Winterfell when the sun was a coin held tight between clouds and earth. Smoke rose from the hot pools. The old stones sweated in their winter way. Men lifted their faces into the steam and let it decorate their beards, laughed, went about the business that was so old it made a shield against new things. The hall held them and the talk, straw crunching under boots that did not lift so they could better hold warmth in their souls. Lyanna took Ned's sleeve and pulled him aside with a quickness that had no apology in it. Her hair escaped its binding again. It was always escaping. "Tell me all of it," she said, though she had been there and seen what men twice her age had failed to notice, and then had noticed too late. "Tell me what the lake water felt like when the white thing came up from under it. Tell me the way Father's hand looked when he let go of the obsidian and put it into yours." "Now." Ned told her this and did not tell her other things, not to keep her safe because there is a lie in believing such things can be done by words, but because some sounds will only live if they are not asked to live too many times. She listened and did not interrupt, which he always took as a gift because interruption was a thing she loved the way cold loves a window. When he finished, she stood with her face turned toward the godswood. "I want to ride to the neck," she said at last. "I want to stand in Meereen Marsh and ask the reeds whether they remember the last time the world went ice mad. I want to find the reeds themselves and see if their bog devils know anything worth hearing." "Them see. You want to go anywhere that is not where you were told to stand," Ned said. But without censure, he thought of the swamps, their green water, and the way the air there moved like a breath kept behind teeth. He thought of Howland Reed, a name that had come with the first ravens out of the neck, when the letters were still small and uncertain. He had met the man once by the fish pond when Ned was smaller, had seen the oddity of his eyes and the way he had made courtesy not a bow but a kind of listening. "Father will say yes," Lyanna said, then rolled her eyes at herself. "Or no. And I will go anyway, and he will send Brandon to fetch me, and Brandon will kiss a girl in a ferry and forget why he came. It's a map. See how everything can be drawn with a straight line when you do not intend to keep to it." "Now, ask him," Ned said. "This isn't horses for the hell of it, Lya." She did that night, while the hall's noise was a soft cloth, and the torches were tired. Rickard's face did the thing it did when White had to be moved from one hand to the other, and a small life sat in the balance. "Go," he said finally, almost impatient, as if refusal would require an argument he did not have time for. "Take 2 men I choose. Take none you choose. Go with words and come back with them. If the reeds reach farther back than we do, and they do, bring what they can spare." "Limsassen." Lyanna kissed his cheek, astonishing him the way a summer bird lands once on a winter branch just to make a game of it. She left as if she had already left when she asked him. Mikken cut black glass with a care he had not shown iron in his life. He had made a knife once for a boy who had cut himself and lied about it, until the blood on the floor had made lying ridiculous. The obsidian nicked the light and drank it. The sound of it when it touched the anvil's face was not the sound metal made. It was a dry sound, like a secret deciding to stop being a secret and becoming a thing too ordinary to talk about. Ned stood and watched and learned the way a smith looks at you as if you were a piece of iron he had to make into something however you insisted on being yourself. Maester Luwine marked lists until lists became a way of calming his hand. Quills wore their nibs down as if words had teeth. He sent a raven to White Harbor that did not need guiding, and still arrived with a set to its wings that spoke of weather. Lord Wyman sent back a letter that took up space with its breadth and courtesies, and concluded with the line, "Ships may carry stone as well as salt." He promised haulage at cost, and then undercut his own cost, and wrote that he would count himself in debt for the price of a candle for every life that came warm into spring because a boat had dropped black glass and iron at Eastwatch in a gale. On Dragonstone, the sea worried at cliffs it had been worrying since first it was given teeth. The old fires under the island did their slow work. Men in cloaks of oilskin and wool climbed down ladders into the mouths of caves and came out with baskets that made their shoulders ache and their wives laugh at their groans. Rhaegar stood where the wind must always win and watched, his hair pulled by salt fingers. He had ink under one fingernail from a book he had not been able to stop reading long enough to wash properly, and he hid it with also not washing because princes can choose their shames. Elia sat by a window that remembered being a piece of sea and held Rhaenys on her lap. "Ain't you doing now?" The girl's hair made the air around it warm. Her laugh. She had laughed twice that morning, lived in Elia's chest, and made the ache there less an ache and more a house with people in it. Aegon slept, and had the look of a boy who dreamed of having a fist he could close around something without dropping it. When Rhaegar came in, he had that look he had when he had decided to be patient with the world, and was certain of failing but chose patience anyway. "You will send stones to men who cannot thank you," Elia said before he could say a word, and then smiled because the words had sounded like rebuke and were nothing like it. "And they will be used to make knives that make very old stories turn a page. How we live to see the bottom of that page, I do not know." "Then no. I am going to ask the king," Rhaegar said, and both of them waited to see what his voice would do to itself. It did not tremble. It had the steadiness that woke in him when he tuned a string, and it found the clean note without asking for excuses. "I am going to ask my father to send stores, men, casks of pitch, carts, and courtesies. I am going to ask him to think of the wall as one of his eyes. I am going to hold a tourney where we must tell the truth in front of too many banners, so that lies will shame themselves." "Bendavander." Elia looked past him to where sea and sky did their old marriage. "You will make men dance, and then hand them spears," she said. "They will accept spears more readily that way. Perhaps you have learned a little Dornish cunning after all." "Then? Nee?" He went to her, and knelt by their daughter, and put his hand over Elia's thin wrist. "I will make songs because men cannot hear speech when fear holds their ears shut," he said, with something that was not apology and not pride. "And I will give swords to men who have swords already and do not know what to swing at." He wrote to the Archmaesters at Oldtown and received back answers that might have been written by the glass in their windows. Cool, clear, and not much use when what one needed was something thick, hot, and strong enough to eat smoke. But one letter came with the smell of cheaper ink and a smudge that looked the way a scar looks when a man stops smoothing it with the heel of his hand. Archmaester Marwyn, who wore his chain like a dare, said, "Yes, I know the sound that cold makes when it is trying to be clever. Send me a piece of what you plan to put into men's hands, and I will tell you how to put it there without losing the hand when it breaks." He wrote of old forges that had burned with the lights. Men said were only so much tale. He wrote of fires under Dragonstone that could be coaxed to teach an anvil new tricks. He wrote with a speed that told of a man finally hearing something worth answering. On the cold plain east of the wall, a boy shot a crow cleanly and hated himself because his mother had taught him to hate waste, and the crow had lived upright for years, and the boy had killed it because he could. He brought the bird into a circle of men in black, and they let him stand there because he wanted to learn what he had wanted to learn, even after he learned he did not like what learning sometimes asks. Lord Commander Corgyle took the bird and cut it open with a neatness that made no apology. He took from its crop a kernel of barley and held it up. "This came from a table of men," he said. "Nothing is separate. We stand on a wall that men built, and we think ourselves stone. But there is barley in the crow, and there is man in the bird, and there is snow in the blood if you listen. When a white man comes to take your breath with his breath, you do not tell him a good story and make him weep. You put fire on his shirt and teach him to be hair and ash again. When one of the thin ones comes with his sword and the way he carries cold like a habit, if you have it, you put black glass in him, or you find a man with old steel for a friend." "Da." He nodded at Harlan Dine, who had come up from the shadow tower with a look like a cliff and a sword that had drunk a Valyrian song for 100 years. Harlan had used it on men more often than he liked to count. He had used it once on a thing that had not bled, and had gone on standing until it had decided not to. The men in the circle looked at the sword with the respect do a thing that had promised to behave, and had kept its promise. Benjen Stark was not there. He was Southern still, half boy and half the shape of the man he would become, laughing when Brandon laughed and frowning when Ned frowned, trying both faces on to see which sat best. But at night, he had found himself looking north sometimes, toward a sky whose stars looked like new nails in old boards. Lyanna told him nothing before she left. That was a kindness. He would not have liked being told a thing he would then have to carry like a bucket that slopped. Lyanna went down out of Winterfell like a word leaves a mouth and refuses to be called back. She had 2 men with her whose names she knew and whose ways she respected because they did not make speeches about being careful. They simply were careful and did not make a meal of it. They went past the causeways the South had laid in its brief and clumsy attempts to turn the Neck into something it could count. They found the soft old roads that are only roads if you know where to place a foot and where to let a foot hover while you think again. They slept in places not meant for sleeping and woke without complaining because complaint is a kind of wasting that draws flies. When they came to Greywater Watch, they came to nothing. And then, when they had learned the lesson nothing had to teach, they came to a low place that was and was not a castle, where the air hummed with midges and with other things that men of stone and banners think are less than they are because numbers are the only way some men can measure. Howland Reed came out with his sister, who had the kind of eyes that find. She had a name that sounded like water on a stone, and Lyanna said it, and the girls smiled, as if to say that people outside the Neck rarely remember to put their mouths where words belong. They sat on reed mats with bowls of fish stew that made Lyanna's mouth sing. Howland let the northern girl empty herself of speech until speech had been spent. Then he rose and took her to a place where the mangroves made pillars and the green water lay quiet as a beast's flank when it sleeps. "The children called us cousins once," he said. "Then they forgot to call. Then we forgot we had been called. But when we are quiet, we can still hear the shape of it. The cold does not love us. It does not hate us either. It acts the way water acts when you remove the thing in its path. We call the others spirits when we are frightened enough to be poets. They are not spirits. They are more rude than that. They are straight. They are a line from what once was to what will be again if men and trees fail to be rude in return." And so, Lyanna put her hand on a mangrove root and felt the slow life there, the clean, patient taking of silt. "My father wants words that do not turn to breath and vanish," she said, and smiled at herself, because of course all words do. "He wants people and places." Howland nodded. "Then you may tell him this. There's old stone at Moat Cailin that is still loyal if asked kindly. The towers there remember the time when the marsh gave the north a door that did not open to snakes. If you will send men with paddles instead of banners, we will show them the places where a boy can get a whole company killed by thinking the ground under him behaves like road. We will give you spears made of things that do not rot when they are wetted. We will bind their heads with swamp gum. We will not ask to be called by names you can say in a hall, if you will simply remember we are real when the bread is passed, and the ale jug comes to you. Then, He looked past Lyanna then, and raised his hand, the way a man raises it when he has seen an old love, and does not want to startle it. Leaf stepped from behind a tree root that had no business being big enough to hide a being, and inclined her head to read as if a long joke had been satisfied. "Cousin," he said. "Cousin." She answered, and Lyanna understood then how much of men's history is written by those who do not know who their uncles are. They spoke softly about things meant for smaller rooms than halls, and Lyanna listened and found she could be quiet without feeling as if something in her would starve if it did not run. They sent ravens from Greywater Watch, which the ravens did not enjoy. They prefer certainty, and the Neck has always refused to allow that as a food. The birds reached Winterfell with reed strands caught in their feet and a smell of marsh in their feathers. Lord Rickard's mouth grew a little softer as he read. He sent men with paddles. He sent men who had learned not to step where the earth shines. Lyanna came back with mud up to her knees and a feeling in her chest, like the first time you ride a horse bareback and find the animal under you becomes your legs without asking for permission. King's Landing simmered in its own juices. Word of obsidian shipments and letters to Old Town and boats upon Blackwater Bay reached the small council, as all words reach such places. Changed in the mouth, chewed by self-interest, spat out with a garnish of fear. Pycelle whispered that the Northern Lords were attempting to revive the power of the First Men at the expense of the Seven, which was a remarkable thing for a man to manage saying without losing his beard. Varys suggested that Dragonstone's quarries might be taxed at a rate that would teach dragons humility and men patience both. He suggested many things in that soft, unwound voice. He also sent letters in other directions that were carried by men who never knew they had been fingers once. Aerys sat in his tower and did not go into the city. He smelled smoke where there was none. He licked his lips in a way that made those who loved him. There were some remember him as a boy and wince. When Rhaegar came and knelt and said that the north and the river and the old eyes that look from trees asked for barrels of pitch and carts and words, he said, with the calmness that is the other side of raving, "We will burn the forests. We will burn them all. Then there will be nothing for the cold to put its fingers into. I will have the pyromancers drain their jars into carts, and I will drag the cart wheels from storm to snow, and make the world a place I can see from the Red Keep." See. Rhaegar closed his eyes, not because he was weary, but because he needed to turn away, and could not. "If you burn the weirwoods," he said, "you will blind yourself. There is a reason our ancestors did not burn them when they came with fire and rope and easy laughter. The trees you fear listened to men who would still have you for a father if you were not a king. They listened to me on the Isle of Faces without laughing. They listened even though I did not deserve it. Let them listen now. Let us be men who ask for help without trying to own the help." Nay. Aerys looked at him and then past him to where Rhaella sat and did not speak, and to where his grandson gurgled and did not know any of the words being spent above his head. "Songs," he said. "You will make songs and sweep men into your net, and you will have me in your net, and I will drown there." Rhaegar bowed his head. He felt the familiar ache. It made a hollow under his breastbone. His hands wanted to fill with music or with blood. "I am going to Harrenhal," he said. "The lords are coming because I asked them to come. They think they are coming for spears dressed as lances, and for ladies' favors, and for the neat clean wound of a defeat that does not cost a son. I will give them that if it buys me the other thing. I will give them songs without lies in them. I will give them a chance to shame themselves for the right reasons." Then so. Aerys' lips stretched and did not become joy. "Go then," he said. "Go and put flowers in northern hair, and see whether weeds think themselves roses when you do it." Rhaegar left the Red Keep with a heat he could not shake out of his skin. In the yard he tuned his harp by the sound of a fountain and a slave child's laugh, and told his fingers that they were not nothing. Varys watched from a carved window and sent 2 messages that contradicted themselves, and both were true. Pycelle stroked his beard with the hand that never trembled when he reached for a flask he had not prescribed. In the Vale, Jon Arryn read Rickard Stark's letter, and then read it again because letters can sometimes reveal their true shape only when looked at by a man more than once, the way a child reveals his true shape only after you have seen him play and sleep both. Robert Baratheon came in with snow in his hair, though there was no snow, only a fierce light that put that thought in men's heads. He threw himself into the room like a thrown spear, and then remembered the man he had been thrown at, and stood straighter. "Words from the north?" he asked, almost gentle, because Ned's name lived in the blood next to his own heart, where the meat is softer than men like to admit. "Is he well? Is he frozen into a statue yet? Will he ever learn to laugh like a proper creature?" Then now. Jon Arryn held the letter like a thing that might break, and smiled despite himself. "He is well," he said. "He is colder than he was yesterday, which he will consider an accomplishment. He asks for something that looks like help, and also like piety, and also like rebellion, depending on which light you hold the words in." Then no. Robert took the letter, read without reading, grew sober, which made him handsomer and older at once. "Ice men," he said. "I have always preferred my enemies with names and the same temperature as my blood." He looked up with a grin that had nothing of mockery in it. "If Ned says the sky is green, I will stroll out and admire the fields above my head. If he says cold has learned to get on feet, I will borrow a warmer cloak. Will the Eyrie make a noise if I say I will ride with them when they call?" He laughed at his own question. He and John Arryn both heard how a boy's impatience sat in the room and demanded attention. "Well, will it?" John Arryn folded the letter and set it down like a cup of something hot. He had a way of making light things heavy and heavy things lighter without changing them at all. "The Eyrie has always been capable of two noises at the same time," he said. "I will make the quieter one the louder if I can. We will send men to Harrenhal, who know how to hit a man softly when they wish to and not leave a bruise on his pride. We will send Lyn Corbray's father with Lady Forlorn and the knowledge of when not to show a blade. We will send milk and oatcakes and letters. We will send you if you can learn to stand still long enough to hear a river speak." Then Nerwandshan. Robert threw his head back and laughed as if laughter were just another form of breathing. "Teach me to be a stone, my lord," he said with mock submission, and then grew still because he had learned to play at stillness the way boys learn to hold their breath to impress each other. "I will go. For Ned and for the sound in your voice when you say this is not jest. I will go, and I will not swing until you cough." Harrenhal rose with its old pretense of being too big for men. It could never be large enough to hold the hunger of the man who had built it. That was its first crime, and it had been sentenced ever since to stand and pretend to have succeeded. In the days before the tourney, the wind ran through its broken bones and sang in corners, because wind will sing anywhere if given leave. Great pavilions went up in the meadows, bright as spilled paint. Small men and great men walked among them with the same caution. The grass hides holes, and the eyes of those who are not called lured hide shrewdness. Howland Reed arrived as if he had not traveled at all, but come up out of the ground below his feet. He had a little shield of leather on his arm and a spear that made men laugh until they saw him hold it, and then they stopped. Lyanna came with the Starks and laughed in a way that made Rhaegar look up and remember the clean sound of a string finding its note. He played a song by a fire the night before the first tilt that had no words men knew, and yet they hummed after, and a child from the kitchens came and stood with his mouth open and forgot to be afraid of lords. Rickard Stark kept to his place and did not make a man of himself in other men's eyes more than was necessary. Yet he was seen. When the lords of the Riverlands came, his hand was there to greet them before their own hands were quite ready. When the men of the Vale came, he was a sober river to Robert's loud sea. When the men of the Reach came with flowers braided into the manes of well-groomed horses and the scent of crushed apples under their breezes, he nodded as if to say that food and fair weather are noble too. He did not go to the king. The king did not come to him. On the third day, after men had made the sounds men love to make when men are allowed to behave as boys with banners, after lances had snapped like grammar in a drunk man's mouth, after ladies' dresses had whispered politics to one another, Rhaegar sent quiet word. Those who could hear without needing to be called were called. Not many came. It is not a great number of men who can step out of a festival because a wind has changed. They gathered in Harrenhal's Godswood, where the weirwood's face looked like the face of a man surprised to find that he still felt surprise. Leaf had come and stood where shade was older than the tree that cast it. A cart stood in the dark, and there was a smell. It was not the sweet, heavy scent of flowers or the pleasant rot of leaves returning to earth. It was the smell of a cellar where brine has leaked and where a man has gone down with a candle and looked around and been glad to bring his eyes back the same size as they were. Men's hands tightened on the shapes they had chosen as friends. Sword, staff, certainty. They brought the thing out, and it did not moan, and it did not show its teeth. The light did something strange around it, as if it had decided to walk around rather than over. It had been a man from the Rills, men said later. He had a scar on his arm where a cat had taken its payment for being badly treated once. It had been there before, and it was there now. And there was something about the scar, how it did not match the way the skin remembered itself otherwise, that made two men near the front fight the urge to retch and think well of themselves, when they did not. Rickard did not look to see who stood beside him, and whether they were important in King's Landing. He looked at the small singer, and at the prince in plain cloak, and at the tree, as if he had to hold 3 thoughts at once, and only one of them would forgive him if he dropped it. He put the shard of obsidian into Lyn Corbray's father's hand, Sir Lionel, a man with iron dignity. And that man, who had worn a Valyrian blade longer than some men have worn a smile, put his palm around the strange light knife, as if to make of his grip the missing weight. But the thing bound in iron moved the way a thought moves when it decides to stand and become a word. It did not struggle. Sir Lionel stepped closer than he wished to, and did what had to be done. The sound the black glass made going in was as thin as smoke in a chapel. The way the body went slack was as heavy as wheat. A little of the wrong cold left the grove, and those who realized they had been colder than the night noticed the way their breath changed and were ashamed of none of it. Rhaegar lifted his head then. He did not speak of prophecies or of stars bleeding. He did not speak of kings. He looked like a man who had been given a different instrument than the one he had practiced on for years, and had decided to play it anyway, because there was a child in the room who needed the song. "Stone," he said. "Fire. One. Oath. And these are not words that belong to one house. You have men who can swing a sword, and men who can count carts, and men who can talk without making lies nervous. You have men who pray with their mouths and men who pray by touching bark. Each of you will go away from this and decide whether you will be ashamed twice or once. You can be ashamed now, because we have been asleep and have allowed our comforts to make fools of us. Or you can wait and be ashamed when the thing beyond the wall walks into your barns, and your wives' rooms and your children's sleep. I will be ashamed now, and hope it spares me having to be ashamed again tomorrow." Then the one now. No one clapped. There are speeches that beg applause, and there are speeches that lay down a piece of iron and ask men to lift it themselves. Men lowered their eyes. Men swallowed. Men's mouths did the shapes that yes and no share when they are kin. It was then, when men were near and their attention bent, and there were more prayers unspoken in the grove than words, that the prince did a careless thing with great calculation. He took up his harp and played a tune that he had written to be simple, so that boys could remember it in the yard, and men could remember it at their sons' names days. He played, and he looked up without looking as a boy does when he knows where a girl stands in a room without wishing to shame her. He played, and he walked, and he set the winter crown, a circlet of red leaves and small bones that Leaf had brought as if to say, "Here, you always loved tokens," upon Lyanna Stark's hair. The sound the grove made at that was mixed. Women breathed out. Men shifted weight. A long, low murmur went up that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with politics. Lyanna stood very still and did not put her hand up to touch the thing. She had learned in the neck how sometimes touching invites breaking. She looked at Rickard, who did not look away from her, and then at Rhaegar, who looked at the tree because some difficulties are not made easier by being looked at head-on. "Queen of? What do you mean her to be queen of?" Someone asked from the edge of the gathering with a laugh in the words that did not get along with the rest of the sentence. "Snow," Rhaegar said lightly, and the lightness was a kind of courtesy. "Queen of our urgency. Queen of the fact that the North has done what we have all done, and done it first, and better. I cannot put flowers on a winter, and have the winter behave itself. I know that. But I can say thank you in the language of fools." Now, Rickard could have made a scene then. He could have made many things. He chose to make nothing. He put his hand on Ned's shoulder beside him and allowed his mouth to move much as it might have moved if he had tasted a stew and found it lacking salt and chosen to add none. Lyanna stood with the circlet on her dark hair and allowed the tree to see that her face had become more complicated and not less. Eris heard about the crowning half an hour after it happened, because there are always eyes that will send a message sooner than their hearts are consulted. The king's anger went through the Red Keep like a fox through a henhouse, making more noise than hunger required. He shouted for Wildfire and for the sons of lords who had laughed. He shouted for Rickard Stark and Brandon, who had not done the laughing, and for Lyanna, who had not blushed. He shouted for Rhaegar, and called him a boy, and then a man, and then a thing for which words fail. Varys went from room to room with a soft expression that made it easier for men to tell lies to a face and not to a wall. Pycelle wrote a long letter to a maester he had despised for 40 years and did not send it. The morning after the crowning, the air felt wrong. Men came out of their pavilions and found that dew had frozen along guy ropes, and that a thin rime of frost lay along the shadowed edges of Harrenhal stones, though the day should have been mild as bread. There was no white thing in the grove this time. There was only the suggestion that the world can move its borders without asking permission. Ned walked the broken curtain wall alone, the frost crunching softly underfoot where shadow persisted. Below, the sound of preparations for another day's pageantry came like the bustle of a city you do not live in and do not need to love. He thought of the sound of an obsidian shard going into a dead chest. He thought of his sister with leaves and bone in her hair, and the way her face had not asked for help, and had not refused it either. He thought of Prince Rhaegar's hands on a harp. He thought of his father's mouth when it had spoken to the grove, and to the men, and to the boy who made of himself a blade. Howland Reed came up onto the wall, as if everywhere were marsh and stone and accident the world had made by inattention. He stood beside Ned and said nothing. They looked north where north merely was an idea from here, and then Howland said, very mildly, if the cold came past Moat Cailin, it would not consider Harrenhal any sort of obstacle at all. No, Ned said. It would not. He rested his hands on the stone and found that they had already learned to accept cold as a companion. We will go home. We will do home things until home becomes a citadel or a cairn. We will not wait for the South to bless our effort. We will bless it ourselves. Howland nodded. Come to us if you need to vanish 1,000 men into a place where 10 can travel. The neck was made for that. We have long memories and short roads. We will lend both. Robert found Ned by the end of that hour, as if drawn by a thread. He looked unusual, not talking. And then the talk burst out of him like a storm out of a mountainside. I have never liked crowns, he said with careless relish. They make men's necks tender. But that, he gestured vaguely in the direction of the Godswood, as if pointing at a deer that had long since run. That was something to make a story. I am not the man to tell it. I will break it, and you will put it back together. But mark me, Ned, the king will not let a song settle that does not have his name in it. You had better be home before the next raven arrives asking your father to bring his bones to court. Now. Ned nodded. We will be gone by noon. They were. They rode out on a day that had decided to pretend it was later in the year than it actually was. The grass under the horses' hooves bent as if remembering snow. Lyanna rode with the circlet gone and a shadow where it had pressed her hair. She rode with a straight back and a jaw that wanted to argue, and had kissed the desire and asked it to ride pillion until it learned to behave. Rhaegar watched them go from a window where the glass had learned how to be transparent with difficulty. He had not slept. He had played until the notes blurred, and then he had sat with his fingers stilled on strings and listened to a night that refused to comfort him. He put his hand against the sill and thought of what is owed to wives, what is owed to children, what is owed to fathers, and what is owed to trees. He considered that none of those debts can be paid without cheating some other debt. He considered he was not a good enough man to design a world where that was not true. He decided to be a man who tried anyway. At the wall, the wind came from the north and brought with it a kind of quiet that scouts recognize and boys do not. Lord Commander Corgyle went up onto the platform, strung along the ice, and stood with his gloved hand on a crenelle, not meant for hands but for cold. He listened. He did not hear white footsteps or the thin song the swords make. He heard only the way sound carries when there is something standing in it you cannot see. Open your books, he told the boy steward who had stood without shivering the longest. Find the ranges of the last year. Find the places where men did not return before men should. Put a mark on the map wherever the woods tell us they have forgotten the habit of birds. We will not guess. We will count. We will pretend to be maesters until the day comes when counting fails, and then we will pretend to be children and sing. Danen, Demtar. The boy ran light-footed to do as he was told, and was not frightened by the thought of singing. That was a small mercy. Harlan Dine oiled the old steel without ceremony, his hands going steady even when the oil thickened with cold. The dragonglass shipments came by sea, to Eastwatch with a rhythm that would have pleased a drummer. White Harbor's men learned the shape of Eastwatch's shoals in the dark. They learned the way a rope must be tied so that it can be cut by a knife in a glove if the sea goes mad. They learned to laugh with the Black Brothers and to stop laughing when told, and they did both as well as men can. Gilles Mormont sent a letter in a hand that had never been beautiful and had never grown ashamed of itself. He said that Longclaw was a sword for men, but that men were not always worthy of their swords. This was not self-abasement but grief, and he would lend the blade to the wall for a year, because a sword's duty is to be held by a hand that needs it. He would come himself when the ice broke in the shivering sea. He asked for no thanks, because he did not do thanks well, and saw no reason to practice. Lyanna made a practice ring in the yard with rope, and boys came to it and laughed until she knocked them down with a wooden sword, because laughter is a good balm and also a way to open a door in your belly. She taught them to listen for their own feet and for the part of their own chest that holds breath in a way you can spend it when you choose. She remembered the way Howland Reed had held his spear like something that could be a poem, and also a stick that keeps a dog out of your dinner. She made the lessons like that, pretty and ugly at once. Leif sat in the godswood and sang until snow slid from branches just to be closer to the sound. Hullen came by once and stood with his hands on the rail of the bridge over the hot pools, and did not know that his eyes had filled until a drop fell and became part of the pool, and was glad to be there. Maester Lewin brought her milk, and she drank it with an odd grace, one she had learned from men, when men still drank from horns with ash carved into them. Ravens went everywhere. Some fell into foxes and eagles and became meat. Most did not. Most carried on with the old stubbornness that makes a world. In the Red Keep, Aerys did a thing that would add kindling to a fire that would not need it. He sent for Lord Rickard Stark, and for Brandon to answer for the insult to the king's grace, and for the insult to songs that do not contain royal names. He had a pyromancer standing behind him when he said it so that the words would smell like oil and fear. Varys watched and did not blink. The letter went on a black wing that had come to know the way between Winterfell and King's Landing, as well as any old soldier knows the path between his bed and the latrine at night. Rickard read and did not crumple the parchment, because parchment does not deserve men's anger, even when it carries it. He sat a long time afterward with his face in the direction his wife had once stood when she laughed at him for putting his boots on the wrong feet, because his mind had been in a book of taxes. He thought of the road underfoot. He thought of a king who had turned his face toward the sun once and been burned. He thought of suns and of chains and of fire that has learned to listen to mad men as if they were gods. He called Ned to him when it was dark and the hall's torches had gone to coals. He did not sit in his chair. He stood by the pillar where the pale root showed through the stone like a truth that refuses to wear clothes. "You will not come south with me," he said, and Ned did not argue. "You will hold Winterfell. You will answer white ravens from the citadel when they come, and you will send me the answer you think is mine. You will take the men from the neck and teach others to walk where the earth floats and where it does not. You will keep Lyanna from turning herself into wind and vanishing clean. You will send to Bear Island if the sea breaks and needs its iron back. You will remember we are not kings and behave like better things." "Ben?" Ned nodded. The words made another map. He did not like the part of the map that had a line south with his father at the end of it. He did not say so. He took his father's hand instead. They did not clasp, not like men proving something. They touched, and there, in that godswood. That is what touching means. Brandon came in not long after with his hair damp from a woman's laughter. He looked at the parchment and did not look at his father's face, because sometimes bravery lies in what you refuse to see. He thumped Ned on the shoulder so hard it would bruise and said, "Keep the home hall. I will bring father back with a story so loud it will break Mikken's anvil." "Nam?" Lyanna came to the doorway then and said nothing at all, and went away again like a gust that does not rattle shutters, because it would be unkind to waking children. Before dawn, a rider in mail that had lost some of its rings and did not feel smaller for it came in from the east. He had a story from White Harbor and a rumor from ships that had run before a freak squall. He said that on a night when it had not been meant to freeze, the sea had made a skin on itself near the mouth of the Mander, thin and foolish as a dream, and broken men had fallen into the water because their hands had reached for a floor that was not there. He said that men had fished out a thing that had been a man, and its eyes had been the wrong kind of blue. Men looked south when he said it, and some of them wanted to run toward the wall. Ned held them with his voice, and with the fact of the hall around them, and with a steadiness he had not known he possessed. "We do not run to fires when there are small flames in our own that need tending," he said. "We send words. We count. We sharpen." He went to the forge and watched Micken make a neat little pile of edges, each one a promise of a choice. He went to the yard and watched boys fall and get up. He went to the stables and let his face be near a good horse's nose, and breathe the animal's hard, simple breath. The day Rickard Stark and Brandon rode south. The sky was low with a light that refused to share itself. Leif stood on the inner wall and watched them go without moving, and when they vanished into the white distance, she turned and walked into the godswood and put her hand on the heart tree's pale bark and did not take it away for a long time. In Harrenhal, after the last tents had gone and men had left their boasting behind like empty cups in grass, the frost did not melt in a corner of the stone yard. A boy from the kitchens touched it and pulled his finger away with a cry. The print of his finger stayed there in the ice until noon. Prince Rhaegar went to Dragonstone as if he could outrun news. He stood over the mines and counted baskets. He wrote to Oldtown without choosing words meant to flatter anger. He sent quiet messages to men he trusted to hold two thoughts at once. Jon Connington, who would die for him too quickly. Arthur Dayne, who would die at his side if dying were asked. Oswell Wend, whose house had given them the ruin in which all their plans had gathered politely to be judged. He wrote to Jon Arryn and asked him to hold Robert tighter than he wished. He wrote to Hoster Tully and asked him to polish the old alliances without making them shine too bright. On the wall, Lord Commander Corgyle sent rangers not to the north alone, but east and west along the forest, teaching the wall to listen to its flanks. They found a village where a cooking pot had boiled dry and cracked, and there had been no one to add water. They found a place where 5 trees had been stripped of bark up to a man's height, and then not higher. And the cuts were very even and had not been made by knives. They brought back branches that would not burn. The road underfoot went on and on. Men walked it with their heads up. Men walked it with their eyes on their boots. Crows flew over it and said the things crows say to one another that men hear as mockery, and are only crows being crows. The cold leaned its elbow on the world and waited. At Winterfell, Ned stood at the edge of the hot pools at dusk, when steam and river wind made an argument neither could win. Lyanna came and stood beside him with her cloak thrown back the way a girl throws a dare. They said nothing for a long time, which was the only way to keep the talk from growing brittle and shattering. "When we were small," she said at last, "I used to pretend these pools were the eyes of a dragon sleeping under the ground, and that if we were not careful, we would wake it, and it would cook us for our bravery. I am less afraid of dragons now." "You were never very afraid of anything," Ned said without warmth or blame. She bumped his shoulder with her own. "You," she said with a grin that showed him that she was trying, "were afraid of old Jory's foxhound." "I was afraid of disappointing it," he said, and they both laughed in the old way and then did not, because the steam rose and a raven chose that moment to crack the air with its small part in the world's music. It brought a white envelope from Oldtown, heavy with wax, and the smell of a place where old things are brought into rooms and forced to be polite. The Citadel had sent a white raven earlier that week, announcing that summer had truly ended and that winter could now be called by name without hyperbole. This envelope held no white bird and no proclamation. It held a letter from Archmaester Marwyn that was all bones and no fat. He wrote of experiments with dragonglass and iron banding, and of a way to mount obsidian points in such a way that they did not shatter at the first meeting of breath and bone. He wrote of old maps of the north that took liberties with distances, but told the truth about fear. He wrote that he had lit a glass candle, and that it had burned, and that he did not consider it a good omen, only an omen, and that omens are like doors. They mean little if a man cannot bring himself to walk through. Ned went to the forge with the letter, and laid it under Mikken's eye, and they talked without ceremony. Mikken tried the Archmaester's binding with rawhide thongs cooked in resin and ash. The first point broke on a pig's skull, and the second did not. The men around the yard cheered like boys at a tilt, and then remembered where they were, and looked around to see if anyone had seen them being boys. Lyanna clapped once as if that one clap might become a thing the day could not do without. Night came down the way. Night comes down when men are writing themselves into the future, without pausing to see if they are spelling the words correctly. Torches made the banners in the hall move as if the beasts on them were alive. Ned lay awake and listened to the world talk to itself. Wolves far off, the anvil's little contented sigh in a cooling forge, a girl's footsteps that he had learned to recognize in any weather. He did not hear snowfall, because snow falling does not speak to ears. But he knew it would be on the ground when morning came. He slept, and in his sleep he stood in the God's Wood, and the heart tree's red eyes were open. Leaf sat at the base of the trunk, and her head nodded once, as if to the end of a song. He woke before dawn with the taste of green in his mouth, and went to the window to look north. The sky there had been pricked by something so small and so cold that men would not have found it with fingers. Light moved in that pricking, not lightning, but the color that lives at the top of the world when night wants to dance. He did not wake the hall. He did not cry out. He put his hand on the cold stone and found it bearable. He stood until the light faded and the plainness of morning returned. Then he turned and walked down into the yard to teach boys not to drop their spears, and to show men how to bind black glass to wood without cutting their own fingers, and to wait for ravens with letters he wanted, and letters he feared, and to be a man whose father had gone south to a king who loved fire too much, and to a city where men counted their breath as if it could be taxed. The road went on, under them all. It was early. It was always early until it was too late. And still men packed oats and sharpened their blades and kissed their wives, and frowned at boys who laughed at the wrong moment. And in the woods beyond the wall, where the old cold taught stones to remember the weight of things, something moved a little closer to the notion of walking among men and letting them hear the song that ice sings when it wants company. K. The morning after the light at the top of the world, a hard blue cold sat on the stones of Winterfell, as if it had been invited and had arrived early out of courtesy. Ned went about the business that fills a keep when men are learning to be two kinds of soldier at once, one for the enemy at their doors, and one for the enemy at the end of the world. In the mews, he stood while ravens pecked at fat and corn and made their small, rude gossip. In the armory, he watched Mikken bind black glass to ash with resin that smelled like a tree teaching itself to bleed without dying. In the yard, he and Sir Roderick marked lines in the snow and called them roads and asked boys to walk them without turning their heads, because a spear that is thinking about a song will forget to be strict. Lyanna rode the perimeter with 2 gray cloaks, whose names she knew and whose children's names she also knew, which made ordering them in danger a sacred and unpleasant act. She rode past the low turf of the barrow outside the eastern wall, where bones older than lords lay patient and unconvinced by the living. She rode to the stone bridge over the hot pools where steam rose and caught in her hair, and made of it a banner whether she wished to fly one or not, and she was thinking of reeds and the firm, sly ground of the neck when she heard the horn at the outer gate. Ravens do not hurry for joy. They hurry because they have something to tell that is burning through their feathers. The bird that came for Ned had flown with the haste of bad news. It struck the perch and clung with a fierceness that left the maester cursing softly as he steadied its leg to loose the strip. Luwin read without preface, and the way breath left him was a shape Ned did not like. "The king summons your father and your brother to answer for." The maester began, and stopped because courtesy sometimes is the only gift a man can give to another man's grief before it has earned its name. He finished in a lower voice. "To answer for treasons of speech and deed, to be made clean in the sight of the gods by judgment." Ned took the strip. The wax bore the 3-headed dragon's stamp, pressed deep as if the hand who had sealed it wished to prove a point to wax. He read, and the blood behind his eyes did a slow, patient thing that told him a road had chosen him, whether he had chosen it or not. He found his father and brother in the God's Wood, where the snow lay thinly on the exposed roots, and the water ran with its old iron story. Rickard listened as a man listens to an old familiar fault in a wall. Something that will have to be mended with both mortar and patience, and will not thank you for either. Brandon paced the way wind paces a ridge, unable to be still without turning stillness into violence. The words were what they were. The king had made of pride a law, and of fear a judgment. He wished to see a wolf kneel. "I will go," Rickard said, as if speaking to the tree would make the decision factual in a way that paper cannot. "I will go, because not going is teaching a lesson to a man who cannot learn anything but fire. I will go because I will not have it said, I hid behind my sons. I will go, and I will make courtesy a shield, and see how long it holds." "Now." Brandon made a sound that was half laugh and half oath. "I will go ahead and tear the door down before you arrive," he said, and if he had been less beloved it would have sounded like bluster. Ned looked at him, and saw in him everything that was admirable, and everything that would break if pushed. Lyanna came through the arch with snow caught in the black comb of her lashes and said nothing. Then she reached for Brandon's wrist and held it until his hand remembered it was attached to a body, and the body lived among other bodies, and that is a kind of grace men forget. That night, the hall was loud with the wrong kind of talk. Men speculate to keep fear thin. They spoke of judges, and of old laws, and of the way a Dornishman once had his head cut off with a sword too dull to make a good story. Ned ate without tasting and left before the meat had cooled. He stood in the dark under the weirwood's bone-colored face, and wondered if his father would ask the tree for permission before riding south. Leaf sat at the foot of the trunk, and looked like something old that had learned to be kind, because it was tired of being right. "If you sing to a fire it answers," she said softly, not looking at him. "The answer is always itself." Men think fires can be persuaded to be songs. They cannot. They burn the song and make a different music. "My father will go," Ned said. "Of course," Leaf answered, as if he had said that rivers run where the ground lets them. "And if the king cannot hear trees anymore, he will make the tree and himself feed fire. It is an old sorrow. I have seen it. I would have wished to see it fewer times." They left at dawn. Rickard did not look back at the wall, because to look can make a man smaller. He wanted to be larger. Brandon made a joke to the gate guard, and then made another, because a joke is a thing you can carry with you into places where knives go through silk more easily than through law. Ned stood on the inner parapet with Lyanna and did not trust his mouth. He lifted a hand in a small motion that meant here and then gone. Lyanna's fingers tightened on the stone until they were white at the tips. When the riders became a moving thought on the white plain, she said in a voice that remembered breath as a habit, "If he sends for you, you will not go." "I will not go," Ned said as a man says. "I will kill if I must, and this is a promise to myself first. I will hold here." He thought of the wall. He thought of the King's Landing heat. He felt both on his skin like beacons lit to confuse ships. They went by the King's Road, a dark ribbon laid over patient earth. At Moat Cailin they stood under the huge hold towers, and Rickard put his hand against stone that had seen the south come beating once, twice, 3 times and go away with new names for its defeats. A man in green and brown whose boots had not been made in a town came up out of the reed beds like thought, and gave them a path where carts would not sink. He did not ask for coin. He asked for a promise that when the north turned its eyes south, it would keep one ear for the sound of frogs. Rickard smiled and promised with the seriousness he reserved for small things that make big things possible. They passed through White Harbor, where Lord Wyman waddled down to meet them with words as heavy as himself, and a warmth that could not be faked. He had heard the talk already. Talk always runs ahead of ravens, because ravens are sensible and rest. He gave Rickard a cask of brandy and Brandon a jest, and an oath that ships would go where they must when the order came. He put his hand on Brandon's shoulder with a weight that said men can be kept in place with kindness as easily as with threat if you know where to touch. At King's Landing the smell came before the sight, rot and spice and the old bad ghost of smoke. Brandon rode like impatience given a horse and went straight to the Red Keep with a boldness that would be called courage by men who died of it, and folly by men who lived. Rickard's face did not move when the gold cloaks closed around his son with the polite brutality of men who have been told to enforce law and given only madness as their example. Eris sat in the throne room like a man married to iron and trying to pretend the marriage is tender. The long hall swallowed sound. A pyromancer's green-sleeved shape stood in a shadow and did the work of making oil seem like a sacrament. Varys was there and was not there. He wears absence as well as he wears silk. Men of the city's ancient houses stood in gowns that smelled of camphor and old pride. Brandon shouted for the prince to come out and die, because a man says words like that when he has not yet learned how long a man can live with himself after a sentence has run out of air. They bound Brandon. They asked Rickard to come as well, and he came with his cloak unpinned and his heart like a stone he had put in his pocket long ago and only now remembered. They set their trap with the courtesy of old law. A demand for champions, and a fire made a champion, and chain for the boy, and a sword just out of reach. The court's mouth watered. It always does when meat is promised. What happened after belongs to the red history of a city that knows many recipes. The king called it a trial by combat. Fire is a god in his theology. Men who liked seeing laws used like knives did not look away. Rickard Stark roasted in his armor while the court watched and murmured at the cleverness, and Brandon strangled himself reaching for the blade, put a finger's width beyond his hand. Rhaegar was not there to raise a word that might have gotten him killed, or might have saved no one. Barristan Selmy stood with his face a mask of grief he did not have the right to show. And Arthur Dayne was away, and Gerald Hightower's eyes were stones. Varys went to his room and sat, and took off his shoes and wept without noise, because noise attracts spies. He sent a raven to a place where Jon Arryn would see it first, and asked a question with no words in it. And now? The words that returned north to Winterfell arrived on a bird that looked older than it was. There are letters that carry their own age in them. Luwin read them, not to himself but to Ned and Lyanna and Sir Roderick in the small chamber that looks out upon the inner yard where boys practice, and men sometimes remember what it is to want to be boys again. He did not rush. There are letters that must be allowed to sit in the air like ash before anyone moves or speaks. Lyanna put both hands on the sill and leaned into the cold stone, and did not cry because there is a stubbornness in sorrow that refuses to waste water. Ned did not move. He felt the world remove a part of him and not replace it with anything. He saw the yard through his father's eyes and understood, with a clarity that made him want to laugh in its cruelty, that he would never again be a son in the way he had been. Robert's letter arrived with the first of the southern ravens. It outran the king's demand that Jon Arryn deliver up his wards to the headsman's cart. Robert's hand was a boy's and a man's both, big and eager, and charged with a humor that could not find room to stretch. He wrote that he loved Ned like a brother, and that a brother's way of loving is to come running with a hammer and to hit until something breaks in the right place. He wrote that he would kill Rhaegar with his own hands and make a song of it to sing at their sons' namesdays. He wrote that he would marry Lyanna. In the same breath he killed a dragon, and that she would laugh at him for bringing blood to a wedding. He wrote like a storm talking to the river it is about to find. The king's demand came after. Cold, legal. The words of a mouth that had decided law is a way to make fear wear jewelry. Jon Arryn did not answer with nonsense. He answered with the old courtesy and said no. He called his banners first quietly and then aloud. The Vale moved like a mountain deciding to stand. Robert called his storms. Hoster Tully weighed duty against the stubbornness of grief, and wrote back that if Ned would keep faith with him, he would keep faith with the oldest promises men know. Bread shared and blood joined. Catelyn Tully's name did not appear on any letter. She lived in the silence between lines. Ned stood a long time in the Godswood and did not beg the tree. He told it what he would do, as if report matters to sap. Leaf came and stood close without touching him. She said, "You are about to take iron in your hand for a man who loves fire more than men. You will leave your wall to the care of boys, and the dead will not pause to pity you for being trapped in two duties." Medsosin. The watch will not be alone, Ned said. We have taught men to bind knives that can end what comes. Eastwatch is filling with black glass. White Harbor is sending boats north as if the sea is a road and not a danger. Jeor Mormont has lent the wall a song in steel as old as his house. The neck will be a net for the living if the south calls us to dance. We have done what we can. If I do not go south, then the king will come north with fire, and give the dead a second army. Oh. Leif's eyes were old wood. I do not tell you what to do. I tell you I am sorry the world forces you to choose. Men think choices make them more than beasts. Sometimes choices simply measure their grief. Bah. They gathered the lords at Winterfell's call. The Great John was not yet great. His laugh was a thing with edges that would grow smoother with sighs. Roose Bolton came with eyes like winter light and a courtesy that bled nothing of the man inside. He stood very small talk with Maester Luwin and did not blink when the Maester spoke of obsidian and of the way glass eats light. He said he would send men to the wall because the Boltons are not fools, and cold does not stop to respect old skins. Stannis Baratheon was still a hard-boned boy at Storm's End, learning to hold tight to a thing out of habit and belief both. He did not write. Robert wrote for them both. The North could not wait for answers from men too far away and too fond of their own answers to questions not yet asked. Ned wrote to Howland Reed and to Lord Wyman, and to Sir Helmund Tallhart at Torrhen Square, and to Lady Barbary Dustin, who wrote back with a hand that looked like a wolf had learned to hold a quill. He sent half to Moat Cailin and half to the Trident, and left over a quarter for the wall, and the fractions felt as ugly as dividing a child among strangers. Lyanna stood on a box and spoke to boys and men alike in the yard. Not like a warrior out of the songs, but like a woman who knew where men are weak and where they can be made strong. She told them to keep their feet when the world moved under them. She told them not to be ashamed of fear, because fear is a beast you can saddle if you know how to approach it. He went to the crypt and stood with the stone men and tried to make his father's face not be stone. He said the things a son says when the world has taken away the possibility of being heard. He put his hand on the sword his stone father held, and it was cold in the old way, the honest cold of earth. When he stood he was older. That is not a trick. It is a way of using skin. They marched. The banners rose like a field kissing wind. Ned left Sir Roderick to shape a garrison for the wall made of men not bound by vow but by fear. He told them he would shame them if they failed and thank them as if they had already succeeded. He left Lyanna with a promise that was both joke and blood, that she would not cut off Roose Bolton's hand if he took liberties with courtesy in her presence, and that if she ever felt the world trying to make a story of her without her consent, she would go to the neck and be wined in the reeds until stories were forced to learn her shape. At River Run, the air smelled like bread because Hoster Tully believed that men who are fed will fight more honestly than men who are hungry. He had lines under his eyes like someone had drawn maps there and then tried to rub them out with a thumb. He took Ned into a small room that had a window not large enough for anyone to enter through or to escape, and told him that grief and duty are brothers who do not like each other, but will share a room if you make them. He spoke Cat's name and looked Ned in the face, and asked him to choose his future in a way that would make sons to put on horses and armies, and Ned said yes in a voice that surprised him with its steadiness. It felt like taking a hand. It felt like betrayal to the part of him that wanted to sit by the weir and listen to wind say the names of those who had gone south. He did it anyway. They met Robert on the Trident's bank, where river light makes men handsomer than they are. He crushed Ned to his breast with a joy that was always honest even when it made trouble, and he looked past him for a dark head with leaves in it, and then looked down with a quick blink that he would always choose to call laughter. He had a hammer new made that had the dignity of an old weapon and the ugliness of a tool. He swung it like a promise. He spoke of Rhaegar as if the prince were a mountain he would knock down simply for the pleasure of showing men what could be done. Ned listened and did not argue. He had liked Rhaegar in the Godswood, even while he had not liked the thing the prince had done. And that is the sort of complicated sorrow that makes a man older still. He told Robert about Eastwatch, about Corgilly's maps, about the ice not burning in certain places, and the way it can be taught to. Robert listened badly, and then better. Jon Arryn listened best and kept his counsel without sting. The first battles were not battles. They were collisions between the king's messengers and men who refused to be messaged. They were burned barns and deposed castellans, and a sept pulled down, not for hate, but for timber. The realm became patchy, green and gold, and red and gray. Each in its own corner, each sending men like letters with the wrong addresses. South of the neck, Winter sent fingers where it was not yet welcome. In a field, a farmer woke to find Frost taking his onions by the neck, and the skins peeling like secrets. On the Green Fork, a thin skim of ice tried to hold the weight of a duck, and broke, and made a sound like a glass harp played by a cruel child. Near Maidenpool, a man pulled a fish from the water, and the fish's eyes were wrong, too pale, and he threw it back and dreamed of pale hands reaching for his ankles. These were not the White Walkers. These were the small notes of a song that had not yet remembered its chorus. At the wall, Lord Commander Corgyle sent 2 rangers to a place the old men called White Tree, because there was a tree there older than any man with a face carved into it, that had seen more faces than a septon in a city. They did not return, and when he sent 4 more with a small hard boy from the Shadow Tower, who laughed at Fear in a way that made Fear want to laugh back. 2 came back, and one had a bite on his leg that did not want to heal, and the other would not sleep, because whenever he did he woke with his mouth full of snow, as if a hand had laid it in there, and patted it down gently. The dragon glass points broke when used badly, and held when used well. Marwyn sent a second letter that smelled of smoke, and said he had found a forge in Old Town willing to make iron bands that would hold black glass like a mother holds a frightened child, firm and yielding both. He wrote that he had dreamed of a wall of ice, and of a man walking along it with a torch that smelled like pine resin, and of blue eyes watching the flame, learning it, making music with it. He did not say that glass candles had burned every night since his first letter. He did not say that he had begun to doubt whether this was a goodness or the opposite of one. Ned won a small fight on the banks of a small river and lost a cousin he had half hated for his ease with girls. He stood in the water afterward and washed blood off his hands, and found that blood is as warm as any kindness when it first meets skin, and that it becomes sticky as soon as the air hears about it. He bent and picked up a shard of black glass that had fallen from a broken spear and put it in his belt, as if that would ward his old life from being eaten. He dreamed of Winterfell stones, and woke under river-smelling canvas, and did not let himself be a boy. He rode among his men and spoke them a simple truth, that they would die in the South if the South asked it, and they would die in the North if the North demanded it, and that dying is not the only way to keep an oath, but it is the clear one. Lyanna wrote from Winterfell in a hand that forgot itself and became wind at the edges. She wrote of boys learning to listen to their feet, of Mikken inventing a way to fix pommels that did not split when cold found them, of Leaf singing to a tree, and a Snowhare coming to sit as if it had decided to be a witness. She wrote that Roose Bolton could be turned with courtesy if you pushed it like a blade, rather than offered it like bread. She wrote that the Neck was doing clever things with men and water, and that she had seen Howland Reed hold a man still by speaking to him in a voice that made staying put sound like wisdom. She wrote nothing of marriage, and everything of memory. And Ned read the letter twice and did not show it to Robert, because Robert would have laughed and been kind about it, and he could not bear kindness for a thing that had become his work and his hunger both. Rhaegar wrote to Ned once. The letter came with a wax seal plain, as if the prince had not wished to remind the paper of dragons. He wrote that he was sending obsidian as if it were bread, and that this cost him nothing because Dragonstone fed it from its heart. He wrote that his father had become a fire he could not approach without ruining his hands, and that he would try to put a ring of earth around that fire, and teach it not to run. He wrote that he had done a foolish, beautiful thing with a crown of leaves, because he had wished to say thank you in a way that would be remembered, and that he had in the same breath made sorrow. He wrote that he did not know how to unmake sorrow without making more. Ned folded the letter carefully and put it in his pack, and did not answer. Some silences are not weapons. They are roofs. News came like snow blown sideways. Much of it, and not where you wanted it. Jon Arryn held the veil like a thing too valuable to wave around in company. He sent men south the careful way, and kept enough behind to stop a knife in the dark from finding his heart. Hoster Tully sent riders who had learned to drink a river with their eyes for news, as well as with their mouths for thirst. Robert fought like a song, and men either loved him for it, or learned to step aside and allow the song to sing itself. And in the night fort, where the old stories sleep badly, there was a sound one night like a door closing very carefully. The brothers who slept there woke and lay without moving, and did not call to one another, because sometimes calling waking things is an invitation. In the morning, a dead thing stood against the old well, and stared at the sky, and made a sound like glass getting ready to crack. A boy with a black glass knife in his shaking hand went forward, and was sick afterward, and then got up and ate, and could not taste the food but swallowed it, because his legs would not hold him otherwise. Winterfell's godswood held liana and leaf, and the heart tree, and once, a man who had walked months through snow to ask if anyone there remembered his sister's name, because he could not bear the thought of it dying only in his mouth. Lyanna took him by the hands and sat him on the bank of the hot pool, and said the name with him, until it became a thing the air had to carry even after he left. Leaf watched with the soft patience of old bark. The tree listened, and did not pretend to answer. Some kindnesses are done without witnesses, and should be. Catelyn came north to meet Ned at River Run, and they spoke words whose edges bled and then healed because they were spoken honestly. He saw in her someone who had learned the cost of making oaths with a father for a witness and a river for a priest. She saw in him a road already underfoot that she had not chosen, and would walk anyway, because love is a thing that can be attached to duty if you tie it with both hands. They stood by the Red Fork while the army made a day's camp, and did not promise to love one another. They promised to keep a house and make winter something less than eating. It was enough to put their hands together and not take them apart until a page coughed, and said the Lord needed to be a lord again. South of them, at King's Landing, Aerys gathered jars and called them by a woman's name he had once used kindly. He spoke to Echo, and Echo was a coward. He sent ravens with insults dressed as laws. He burned a man who had done nothing but own a field in the wrong place. He dreamed of fire listening to him, and woke with his own nails in his palms, and blood spilled that looked black in moonlight. He made Sir Jaime Lannister stand at the foot of the throne and be young and strong and powerless, and that is an unkindness kings have always loved. One night on the King's Road, Ned dreamed of the Isle of Faces, and in his dream the lake opened an eyelid and looked at him, not unkind and not kind. Blank as water is when it is honest. He woke and heard wolves far away, and a sound that could have been ice arguing with itself. He rose and checked the watch, and looked to the north where no light moved, and then to the south where a low red smeared the horizon, and he did not allow himself to name it. He met Rhaegar once more, not in a hall but on a road, with only a handful of riders on each side. It was an accident, or something older than accidents. They sat their horses at a distance polite to war, and let the air think for them when brains would not. Rhaegar's harp was not on his back. He had a sword, and it was old. Ned inclined his head because some honors are due even when you think they may be dangerous. Rhaegar did the same and then did something he had not done before. He laughed quietly. "We are men making a thing bigger than ourselves," he said. "And we do it with hands full of loss. I do not know if that makes us brave or merely poor judges of what can be held." "It makes us men of the North and South both," Ned said. "And that makes us late for something." Rhaegar looked at the sky and nodded. "They have long told us we do not own the day," he said. "We should have believed them sooner. They parted because parting is a mercy when staying puts blood in the wrong place. They would meet again by accident and design, and not again at all, depending on which singer you listened to, and whether you had learned, as Leaf had told Ned once, that songs are doors meant to be opened slowly. Word rode hard that Tywin Lannister would not come and would. Word rode that he had shut his gates, and spent coin like a miser with an itch, and sharpened swords like a priest polishing a chalice. Westermen marched under dull silver skies. The Reach sang to its own harvests, and sent second sons with gleaming teeth. The Dornish watched heat shimmer on their roads and wrote letters that were daggers and blankets both. The sea moved stores to Eastwatch in lines of salt and tar. Men at the top of the world looked south as often as they looked north, because the dead do not require courtesy, and the living do. Near the end of the first season of Killing, Ned came to a farmhouse where a woman had died with a baby under her arm, and a boy, with a ragged spear, sat in the doorway, and would not move aside for men in mail. He climbed from his horse and crouched and put his hand on the spear, and then on the boy's wrist. He said nothing. He did not ask where the father was because he could see the father in a cart abandoned by the road. He stood and told Sir Roderick to have the men bury the dead, and take the living into the column, and find a woman with milk, if they could, and if they could not, they would share theirs, and shut their mouths about inconvenience. He rode away, and did not look back, because looking back sometimes turns a man to salt. He carried with him the shape of the boy's wrist under his thumb. It was thin. It was fierce. It was not a story. It was a life. He dreamed again of the light at the top of the world, and this time there were words in it, or something like words, and he did not try to remember them upon waking, because some gifts must not be forced to name themselves. He woke and found frost on the inside of the tent, and went to the opening and pulled it back to see a camp of men lying under a sky clean enough to break. Somewhere, far north of him, a white shape walked between trees so old they had roots and stories no maester had written. And behind it came 3 smaller shapes that had once been men. They moved with a patience that had not been taught, and would not be hurried. They stopped at a stream that ran black with a skin of ice, and one of the smaller shapes bent and drank, and the ice did not break where a man's lips touched it. At Eastwatch, a ship from White Harbor limped into its moorings with a ragged hole above the water line, where something had struck it in a sea that should have been only wind and water. The captain put his hand on the plank and swore to the gods that it had not been ice, and not a rock, and not a whale. He said something had been as hard as iron and as smooth as lake water under moon, and his men had wept when they saw it because of the sound it made when it scraped the hull. The thin wrong singing that men will one day learn is the common language of an enemy. Corgyle stood on the eastern tower and watched the ship, and sent a boy to the rookery, and wrote with his own hand a letter to be sent everywhere Obsidian traveled. And the letter had only a few lines because there are days when too many words are a sin. He wrote that the sea had learned to put its hand against the world too early by a season, and that if winter now had 3 tongues, air, earth and water, the wall would need 5. And in the God's Wood at Winterfell, where roots think, Leaf sang the smallest song she knew, the one they had given dear to help them remember how to be gentle even when their bodies were built to run through thicket, and leave scratches where flowers wished to be born. Lyanna sat and braided her hair without watching her hands, and thought of a prince who had put leaves and bone in it, and of a man who loved her like a storm loves an open field, and she did not choose between them, because there was nothing to choose. Choosing love had been stolen from her the moment men had decided war would count as speech. Ned's column moved toward a ford where the trident spread itself wide as a man's arms in greeting, and ahead were enemies, and behind were friends, and beneath was a road covered by water and old stones and cold, and above was a sky thinking about snow. He felt the weight of obsidian at his belt, as if it were a promise tied there by a hand smaller and older than his, and he set his horse forward, and the men behind him made the noise men make when they refuse to forget their throats are instruments. He thought of his father's hand on his shoulder, and of a boy at Eastwatch finding courage in a knife that wanted to break, and did not, and of Robert laughing with blood in his mouth, and of John Aaron's quiet, and of Hoster Tully's food and sorrow, and of Rhaegar's letter folded neatly in his pack, and of Lyanna's hair in his hands when she was a child, and he made a crown of hay for her, and she had thrown it down and ridden a broom instead and cowed herself away. The river took his horse to the knee, and then to the hock, and then gave the animal back again. Men on the far bank shouted names of kings and gods, and of their mothers without shame. In the midst of it, a raven came out of the north and dropped like a stone, and then found its wings again and shook the water off and lit on Ned's shoulder, which made his horse shy and him block the movement with a knee, because men who do not keep their seats have their thoughts knocked out of them. Lewin's neat, upright hand made black gallows out of letters. Ned read while water struck his boots and men shouted. He looked north once, as a man looks to see if a mountain is still where he left it. Then he handed the strip to Sir Roderick and said, as if remarking on weather, "Eastwatch reports things that will not burn." Sir Roderick's beard moved, and beneath it, his mouth made the shape a man uses when he is about to swear and decides to save the word for later. "Then we had better win here quickly," he said, and brought his sword up with a motion that had learned to be beautiful by labor rather than love. There is a way men make a road out of water when they are forced to. A churned, cold brown path that reads like a sentence even after it has been erased by downstream. They did that now. The hammer fell and the swords answered, and in the middle of the noise Ned felt, for a thin, not quite moment, the presence of the road under everything, older than gods, patient as frost. He had the terrible, consoling thought that no matter what songs were sung about kings and their sons, the road would carry what it needed to carry, and that men might choose to make of themselves carts or boots or stones. He chose to be boots. He set his teeth and went forward, and the north and south pulled at him like two dogs quarreling over the same bone. And somewhere far away trees listened, and somewhere nearer men at a wall of ice set black glass points with careful hands, and looked east where the sea had begun, on a night it should not have, to learn the stark and simple language of winter.